Our first speaker this morning is Nala Mansell-McKenna. I only met Nala this morning, and all I had to go on were a few details that I had received before the conference. So I did what any self-respecting researcher and former tabloid journalist would do, and I Google stalked her last night. Sorry, Nala. And this is what I found. Nala Mansell-McKenna has been shaking things up in Tasmania for quite some time. She stands up for her people, for what she believes in, and she does this in multiple ways, whether it be holding local rallies, meeting with state politicians to tell them what they're doing wrong, or addressing the United Nations to tell them what they could be doing better. Nala is a proud and passionate advocate for Aboriginal sovereignty and self-determination. She is currently involved in a campaign against the celebration of Invasion Day in Australia, otherwise known to the masses as Australia Day. She has been a very strong and vocal critic of the very disturbing intervention being conducted by the Australian government in Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory. Nala earned her stripes as a youth worker, as a cultural promotion worker, and as a twice elected secretary for the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, which is an Aboriginal community-controlled organisation. Nala has taken part in many Aboriginal leadership groups and forums at the national level, and she recently participated in the UN Indigenous Fellowship Program in Geneva. And on top of all of that, she is also studying for a diploma in land and heritage management. Ko pakana te iwi, ko Nala Mansell-McKenna. Nau mai haere mai, Nala.
Ia pulingina, mina Nala Mansell, mina pakana palawa luna rala, taipani tutuita. Mina ningina nairi, waikato iwi, nika me latina nanya, wanita takamuna. Mina takamuna rala, mina palawa takarilia manta manta. Raiti ningina kani mana, putia nairi, wanita palawa kani. Raiti ningina palawa kani krakapaka. Mina tunapri, mina kani, lumi paya kuwulya. Raiti ningina, palawa, waikato me latina wanita takara. Mina tunapri laina, topiri kunani ningina, waikato takarilia, lakapawa nina nari tu. Nina nari pulingina mina lumi, kani pakana palawa. Wanita tunapri Maori, Aotearoa, pulingina mina, milatina nanya war. Kia ora, my name is Nala Mansell, and I'm a proud Aboriginal woman from Tasmania, Australia. It gives me great pleasure to speak to you in the language of my ancestors, which was taken away from us for so long, but recently regained and strengthened by the Tasmanian Aboriginal community. Based on the fact that there are no fluent speakers of my language left in Tasmania, I'd like to acknowledge that this would be the first time my language has been spoken here in Aotearoa in at least 200 years. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Waikato tribe, whose lands we meet on here today. I'd like to acknowledge the Waikato Ancestral River and the Taupiri Ancestral Mountain, which connects the Waikato people to their past and guides them through their future. I'd also like to thank the Māori people of Aotearoa for having me here on their beautiful land. It's an absolute privilege to be invited to speak here today on behalf of my people across Australia. While mutton birding, basket weaving, language revival, and being colonised by the British are some of the things that Tasmanian Aborigines and Māori people have in common, our fight against racism, assimilation, oppression, and being treated as outcasts in our own land are also very similar. Our hopes for sovereignty, self-determination, and our legitimate rights as the original people of our lands is also something that we share. So I hope that my talk this morning gives you an idea of what's going on for us over there in Tasmania and on mainland Australia, and also that you find it relevant to your people and your struggles here in Aotearoa. Before I start, I'll just let you know that I'm not an academic. I haven't yet mastered the art of public speaking. So I'm going to just read off the paper, and I've put together a PowerPoint presentation and tried to add as many photos in of my community in Tasmania as well as some on the mainland, so that hopefully you can enjoy looking at them rather than watching me read off the paper. Sorry, I can't find the clicky thing to change. Oh, there we go. Got it. Right. Before the invasion of Australia in 1788, Aborigines had full control of our own destinies. We had our own laws and education system. We had exclusive rights over the whole country, its islands and its seas. In modern day language, we were a sovereign people. Since then, we've been invaded, murdered, imprisoned, neglected and shunned. The only reference to Aborigines in the 1901 Constitution was to exclude us from being citizens, which meant that we were part of the flora and fauna of Australia rather than human beings. Well, that's if you lived on mainland Australia. If you're in Tasmania, you didn't even exist. 200 years of total domination by the white man in our country has scarred us deeply. It'll take a long time for us as a people to recover. It'll take even longer if the political framework remains where the white people continue to make all the decisions for us. Our children are forced to attend schools that are based on the needs of white people, where they must speak English, and they're still being taught that the Australian history started when Captain Cook discovered it. They're also told to stand up and sing Australia's national anthem about a history young and free. Funny that, when Aborigines have been in Australia since time began, and you only have to look at Aborigines in the Northern Territory to know that we are certainly not free. Australia has been unrelenting in its determination to rid itself of its Aboriginal problem. After slaughtering thousands of Aborigines during the invasion, many were removed from their traditional homelands and had their children stolen from them because of their race. This continued up until the 1970s. Tasmania is still the only state in Australia to have compensated the stolen generation. Other Aboriginal victims from across the country got an apology from the Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who gained great credibility for himself but left the victims penniless by refusing to provide compensation. It's easy to see why Australia prefers to leave things the way they are. Full control and dominance over the lives of Aboriginal people enables them to develop while we continue to be held back. The standard of living in Australia is one of the highest in the entire world. We're amongst the most richest and most prosperous countries in the world, with one of the most stable political democracies. Yet when it comes to Aborigines, the statistics are not worthy of the same bragging rights. They're horrifying. Our people die 20 years younger than white people. Our babies are dying at 3 times the rate of the white population. We're 15 times more likely to end up in prison. Our children are 8 times more likely to be taken from their families and placed in out-of-home care. Our unemployment rate is 3 times higher than white people. 40% of Aboriginal children complete Year 12 compared to 80% of non-Aboriginal children. And although suicide was unknown to Aboriginal people traditionally, Aborigines are 3 times more likely to commit suicide. In 2011, the number of Aboriginal suicides in Australia exceeded the number of Australian Defence Force fatalities in Afghanistan. On the Tiwi Islands, north of Darwin in the Northern Territory, steel spikes were put on the power poles to try to stop young people from hanging themselves. These islands were once known as the suicide capital of the world. An article in the Sydney Morning Herald states that Australia is the only place on the planet where Indigenous health and wellbeing are going backwards. There were 250 Aboriginal languages spoken in Australia before the whites invaded our country, There are now only 60 Aboriginal languages spoken as a first language. In Tasmania, where I'm from, there were 6 or 7 different language groups before the British arrived, rounded us up and sent us off to prison camps under false pretences. If the languages didn't die along with their speakers, who couldn't fight off the introduced diseases or starvation or living conditions, it was made very clear that these languages were no longer to be spoken, and they weren't for a very long time. Professor Gilad Zuckerman, a linguist at the Adelaide University, says that Australia holds one of the world's records for the killing of its languages. This is easy to see. My community has recently combined certain written and recorded words from the various language nations along with community knowledge to form one Tasmanian Aboriginal language. And although we have no fluent speakers, our children are still growing up with their own language, which is something our parents and their parents couldn't do. Australia also has one of the weakest protections of human rights in the Western world, implementing less than half of its legal obligations of international human rights treaties. Now they're openly talking about dumping internationally recognised instruments on refugees as well. There's a clear relationship between the social disadvantages of Aboriginal people and the crisis of Aboriginal health. These social disadvantages, directly related to colonisation, dispossession, oppression, dislocation and discrimination, and characterised by poverty and powerlessness, are reflected in figures that have only marginally improved with government funding. Our health standards are like that of third world countries. We have had enough. No longer can we accept that Aboriginal self-determination is just a distant dream. Our right to determine our own futures seems to have denied us, but that vision, that right, has not been forgotten. While we're busy having to react to oppressive government policies, we forget about coming together as a people to talk about where it is that we want to be in the next 10 or 20 years. The Australian Constitution shows that white people agreed to the establishment of an Australian nation, but there's nothing to show that Aborigines agreed to this new nation, and there's certainly no evidence to suggest that we agreed to be part of it. The assertion that there is a single sovereign people in Australia is based on superiority. Who says that there is only one sovereign? And who gave that group the right to make the decision? The idea that Australia is one nation is a familiar chant. I can't imagine any Aborigine in Australia who hasn't felt the pressure to live and act like white people. Any Aborigine who attempts to assert their sovereign right is seen as troublemakers and is accused of promoting separatism. Those of us who refuse to join in the callous and insensitive Australia Day celebrations on the anniversary of the invasion of our lands are told to just move on and forget the past. Yet every Anzac Day, the country comes to a standstill in recognition of wars that took place in other parts of the world over 100 years ago. Aborigines have rights that no others in Australia can legitimately claim. We must stand up and demand our rights as the legitimate people of our land. I'm not talking about Aboriginal jobs in government departments or work for the dole schemes. I'm talking about the right to our country, the right to self-determination and the right to our own government. We want to be the ones in control of our own destinies. We want to be the ones in control of our own lives. No longer should we have to plead with governments to return the lands that they stole from us. No longer should we be forced to march the streets and protest to have our voices heard. No longer should we be arrested for fighting for the protection of our ancient sacred sites from government developments. We have a right to self-determination. On the 16th of July 1999, the Aboriginal Provisional Government was formally founded. Its purpose was to establish an Aboriginal government and an Aboriginal nation state. The APG views that the Indigenous people of Australia never relinquished their sovereignty, and therefore Australian law and title over the country is null and void. Like the Palestinians, we are occupied. We have our own Aboriginal birth certificates so that our newborns are not forced to register with the occupier, and we have Aboriginal passports that Australia refuses to accept. And as I found out on my way here to Aotearoa, so does New Zealand. When I return home, I'll present my Aboriginal passport at the gates back into Australia and tell them it's the only one I have. Good luck trying to send me back to my own country. Internal self-determination can be exercised under Australia's constitution, which provides for the addition of new states. If we were to become a sovereign nation, we'd need the return of Crown land, and rather than Aborigines from across Australia having to relocate to one area of land, we could have land spread across the country to enable Aboriginal communities to live on their traditional homelands if they chose to do so. Enough land would be returned to Aborigines across Australia to enable us to survive as a nation of people, and the remaining land could be kept by white people and their government as a basis for them to continue their nation. Some may choose to continue to live in the cities or in the country, but the important thing is that the choice would be there for them to make, a choice that we don't have at the moment. It may be way off, but while we beg and scrape and prop up the rights of politicians to make the decisions for us, we will never get closer to our vision. In 1983, the Central Australian Aboriginal Organisation told the 200 Years Later inquiry, "We have never conceded defeat and will continue to resist this ongoing attempt to subjugate us. The Aboriginal people have never surrendered to the European invasion and assert that sovereignty over all of Australia lies with them. The settler state has been set up on Aboriginal land. We demand that the colonial settlers who have seized the land recognise this sovereignty and on that basis negotiate their rights to be here." This is not a call to arms, but a call to action. We may have been dominated for a long time and to such an extraordinary extent, but in all that, we've not lost our dignity nor sight of our entitlements. We dream of once again being in control of our own lives, with our heads held high, proud of who we are, how we overcame adversity, and how we have found our place amongst the peoples of the world. Forget native title, let's make a deal, let's sign a treaty. But how do we get there from here? When the APG was first established, it had 1,000 paid-up Aboriginal members and 1,500 non-Aboriginal associate members who were just as eager to be part of the struggle for Aboriginal sovereignty as we were. Aboriginal sovereignty requires a joint effort. We can't fight it alone. We need people like you here in this room, people who can help bring about change. We need a new movement of people who understand the meaning of Aboriginal self-determination, people who understand the meaning of Aboriginal sovereignty and are willing to live it. We need a national movement. We need an international movement. We need to show our country that there is no need for white supremacy and domination of our people, and that we can live in harmony side by side with mutual respects as nations, not one dominating the other. We need people power. People power is what changed the 1967 referendum. People power is what ended the Vietnam War. We are ready to take our place alongside the Cubans, alongside our brothers and sisters in Chile and Venezuela, like our Indian brothers and sisters in Central and Northern America, not as a people dominated by our invaders who have convinced us of their white superiority. We want to be able to take our place along the nations of the world as a people proud and free. In 1992, Australia's High Court overturned the racist legal fiction of terra nullius, meaning no man's land, and at least acknowledged our prior ownership and the shocking history of unlawful dispossession. The Bringing Them Home report was published, acknowledging that officials around the country had forcibly removed thousands of Aboriginal children from their families and communities on an ethnic cleansing scale. ATSIC was the organisation set up as our national Aboriginal voice. It wasn't perfect. It had many critics from inside the federal government who claimed it was corrupt, but I thought that was essential for being elected in Australia. The only hope Aborigines had of getting our land back was through native title, which forced Aborigines to prove to the white man a continual, uninterrupted connection to our lands. even though they were the ones that forcibly removed us from our traditional homelands, making 90% of the Aboriginal population unable to prove native title, a humiliating process where the dispossessed are forced to prove theft to the thieves. In Tasmania, we now have Aboriginal land rights legislation, where the government returns land to the whole Tasmanian Aboriginal community for the simple fact that they stole it from us, but not without strings attached. While goodwill has shown efforts made by past Tasmanian governments, we cannot forget that not long ago we owned 100% of Tasmania, and after 200 years of fighting and pleading with governments, we now own 0.08%. In 1970, Australian writer Xavier Herbert gave what I think is a very good description of Australia's responsibility to return stolen lands to Aborigines when he said, "Until we give back to the black man just a bit of the land that was his, and give it back without provisos, without strings to snatch it back, without anything but complete generosity of spirit in concession for all the evil we have done him, until we do that, we shall remain what we have always been so far, a people without integrity, not a nation, but a community of thieves." In the 1990s, we managed to survive the savage attacks of Pauline Hanson. With her demise, I suppose it shouldn't have come as a surprise to find that her openly racist ideas were expressed in the philosophy and aspirations of John Howard and his government. As the New Zealand Māori Party Member of Parliament, Hone Harawira, put it, John Howard was a racist bastard. Furthermore, his mission to extinguish Aboriginal culture and force Aborigines into the Western market economy has become increasingly apparent. It is more than an assimilation policy, it's cultural genocide. The truth has to come out before we can move on. Children in Australia learn about Jesus being nailed to the cross, they learn about the Jewish Holocaust, and they learn a lot about the Australian soldiers killed in the 2 world wars. But how many people in Australia can name one site where Aboriginal people were massacred? Some people know of the history of Botany Bay, but there are Aboriginal historical locations all around the country still known to so few, including Aborigines. We've been dispossessed of much of our history as well as much of our culture. Now, more than 200 years later, it looks set to happen all over again in the Northern Territory. Michael Mansell has written about this renewed attempt at genocide, saying, "Aboriginal communities are linked to a particular geographical area where language and cultural beliefs are unique to that community. As the invader takes over the lands and replaces the old institutions and languages with its own, much of the Aboriginal ways will be subsumed within the civic and political life of the invader and is more likely to disappear. New values are adopted as a survival tool." Gradual erosion of Aboriginal values and cultural knowledge threatens the long-term identity of Indigenous groups. The political preaching of oneness by schools, media and politicians must undermine Indigenous identity. The once sharp line that distinguished Aboriginal identity from whites is blurred by the widespread use of the politically correct phrases such as "we are all Australian." There are 2 main reasons to explain why the once vocal and very visible Aboriginal struggle suddenly disappeared, and with it our hopes to advance. The first is the massive right-wing swing in Australia's political parties, supported by timid media. The second is the promotion by ultra-conservatives of those Aborigines willing to say what the whites want to hear. It's regrettable that instead of a healthy range of inspirational voices being heard, the only Aboriginal voices listened to now are those promoting assimilation. The theory of assimilation is based on the superiority of one people over another. One society, usually whites, is supposed to be so unquestionably attractive that we all want to abandon our heritage, our hopes, and importantly, our independent political aspirations to be like them. Not for a fleeting moment have I ever believed that my people are in any way inferior to the white men. There's nothing wrong with being different. In some parts of the world, difference is valued, but not in Australia. Australia was built on the blood of Aboriginal people, yet they believe they owe us nothing. When domination of one people by another is so pronounced over such a long period, white Australia finds it hard to see their own faults. Outside of Australia, people see things differently. Here in Aotearoa, you have a treaty, designated Māori seats in Parliament, and economic fishing quotas, amongst other things. They might not be perfect, but we don't have any of them. We need a powerful, independent political voice. We're working on that. If we can succeed in getting the Northern Territory intervention laws repealed, it means we have some clout. Seats in Parliament might be a first step, but nowhere near as effective as our own Aboriginal government. No more advising white people what they should do about us. We are the ones that will decide. Anyone ever heard of the Palestinians sitting on an Israeli advisory body? Under existing law, Aboriginal groups around the country could be given at least local government powers over their lands and people. 5% of Australian land taxes should be set aside for Aborigines, and we should be able to veto laws that adversely affect us. Then we can really protect our culture, our language, and our heritage and create a better future. By the year 2000, things were starting to look up. Hundreds of thousands, if not more, Australians participated in organised walks for reconciliation, showing there was plenty of goodwill out there to be harnessed. Then in the year 2007, John Howard dropped a bomb when they announced that they were going to introduce the Northern Territory intervention, which was so racist they had to amend the Racial Discrimination Act to put it into place. They claim the intervention was an emergency response needed to tackle child abuse in Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory. 6 years on, and not one Aborigine has been found guilty of any charges relating to child abuse, but the invasion of the communities remain. I'll now go into further detail of the Northern Territory intervention, or what they now call Stronger Futures legislation, but what we know to be the Northern Territory invasion. The Northern Territory has about 10% of the country's Aboriginal population, and of the 193,000 people in the Northern Territory, around 60,000 are Aboriginal or Islanders. Aborigines make up a whopping 30% of the population of the Northern Territory. Over 10,000 people have an Aboriginal language as their main language. A massive 6% of Aboriginal adults live in overcrowded housing conditions in the Northern Territory. Estimates say that at least $1 billion is required to overcome the Aboriginal housing backlog in the Northern Territory alone. It's not that the politicians don't know the consequences of their inactions. Minister Elliott McAdams' parliamentary speech shows a proper understanding of the relationship between overcrowding housing and the ill effects on health, education, and all other social indicators, including skin sores and other infections in childhood, resulting in kidney disease, rheumatic heart disease, deafness, blindness, and delayed intellectual functioning in later life. That is, if the kids get old enough to be of school age and then manage to survive beyond early middle age. The infections that are so easily fixed by antibiotics are either not fixed in the first place because of the absence of health services, or are fixed but reinfection occurs immediately because of the problem with overcrowded housing. The Little Children Are Sacred report is the report on which John Howard and Mal Brough relied on to justify their military actions in the Northern Territory. The report made 97 recommendations. It's unfortunate in this case that the first recommendation was that governments must take the lead. This can never be right in Aboriginal affairs. Governments should be there to resource and facilitate Aboriginal initiatives, not take the lead. It needs to be emphasised that the first recommendation said that there had to be genuine consultation and collaboration partnerships between governments and Aboriginal communities in finding solution to this issue of urgent national significance. Nowhere was it remotely suggested that the Commonwealth should take military action, and send in the army, police, and a whole range of outsiders? The report went on to make recommendations for holistic reforms for things like preventative health services, family support services, community education and employment and training schemes, and increasing house supply. But the main thing the federal government did in the wake of the report was firstly ignore its recommendations and instead barred Aboriginal communities from having any alcohol, took over management of half of their welfare payments, got rid of the systems in place which required permits for outsiders to enter Aboriginal lands, and forced Aborigines to hand over ownership of their traditionally owned lands in return for basic health care and necessities. It's no wonder the emergency measures are being labelled as a direct attack on Aboriginal land rights and Aboriginal self-determination. The drastic action taken by Howard and Brough have been labelled as an attempt to extinguish Aboriginal culture, a land grab, an act of ethnocide, an essential step in opening up the country for uranium mining. John Howard and Mal Brough, of course, have sold it as being necessary to save Aboriginal kids from sexual predators in their midst. But when the army goes into an area without the permission or request of the people of those areas, it looks like an invasion, and it is an invasion. There is, however, one spin-off from the invasion which gives us some hope for the future. First, by sending in the police and the military, the Australian government recognises the status of Aboriginal Australia as an entity separate from white Australia. A nation cannot invade itself. There's no doubt a reason for the Howard government's determination to call the invasion a response to a national emergency, an intervention or an arrangement, anything but an invasion. This is not to say the invasion was for the best. It was not and never will be. The Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission listed what they politely termed as the Northern Territory's interventions, potential contraventions of human rights law, specifically the right to equality before the law, the right to self-determination, the right not to be deprived of poverty, and the right to social security. Breaches of the newly adopted United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People are far too numerous to list today. 164 countries in the General Assembly and only 4 countries dissented to the declaration. It's not hard to guess which ones. Yep, the United States, Canada, New Zealand and Australia, and it's not hard to guess why. It's said that Australia dissented because it disagreed with the Indigenous right to self-determination, but listen to just a few other Indigenous rights that they have shown themselves to oppose recently. The right to maintain and strengthen distinct political, legal, economic, social and cultural institutions, the collective right to live in freedom, peace and security as distinct peoples and not subject to any act of genocide or any acts of violence, including forcibly removing children of one group to another group, the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of culture, the right to practice and revitalise their cultural traditions and customs, and the right to establish and control their educational systems. The list goes on. So what can be learnt from all this and how can we move on? Firstly, we need to resist attacks on our rights whenever they occur and be as visible and vocal as we can about the resistance. In Tasmania, we took to the streets of Launceston with our campaign t-shirts. Men, women and children shouted abusive slogans about John Howard for hours before he appeared at a fundraising launch and was quickly ushered away from us and into the building. To see the Prime Minister running away from a screaming mob of blackfellas is pretty powerful for those who are part of it, I can tell you. And these occasions are long remembered by the children and young people who are fortunate enough to be brought along by their parents. Secondly, we need to stay part of the national and international Aboriginal movement, however little life there seems to be in it from time to time. Tasmania can be a tiny beacon of hope for those who have bowed down by fear and oppression than we are, and we can be fortified in our determination by being living witnesses to the result of attempt of genocide and assimilation. All around the country, Aborigines are hearing about our street protests. At every national meeting we go to, there's an Aborigine inspired by our determination to stand up to those who seek to silence us. It's not usually the vocal leaders, but it's the ordinary people who are looking for effective and active leadership and inspiration for what they are feeling. Thirdly, we need to stay in charge of our own affairs and our own destiny. The ease with which the Australian military and police marched into the Northern Territory communities and stayed there should inspire us to heighten our consciousness and determination for Aborigines to stay in control of our own destiny. In Tasmania, this is a constant battle, although I don't suppose we've got that on our own. We have ridiculous situations where the Tasmanian Heritage Council, backed by Tasmanian legislation, is still telling us what we can and can't do, and those tiny remnants of our land that have been returned to us are also with conditions. Fourthly, we need to be vigilant for assimilation and genocide in all their forms. The Northern Territory intervention is a timely reminder that the next attempt at total genocide is just around the corner, or is indeed upon us already. We have to be ever vigilant about the various forms of genocide, ethnocide, or assimilation. At present, the widespread demand for mainstream education and the high rates of removal of Aboriginal children from their families and community for so-called child protection reasons are the main threats. The undermining of the Aboriginal community by self-appointed experts such as publicity-seeking Richard Flanagan or the jaded academic Henry Reynolds are extra threats. Both have reverted to the pre-1970s talk suggesting that us Tasmanian Aborigines aren't real Aborigines but something else, some kind of hybrid or half-castes, different and lesser than the real Aborigines on the mainland. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People gives us hope that we might yet live to see the High Courts rethink its position on Aboriginal sovereignty. The first white contact with Aboriginal people in some parts of the Northern Territory is with living memory of some people. Massacres have occurred within lifetime of our grandparents, or in actual lifetimes for some. They are not ancient histories. Yet already those who speak an Aboriginal language as a first language in the Northern Territory are very much amongst the minority. Not one Tasmanian Aborigine speaks their language fluently. Assimilation, ethnocide and attempted genocide, call it what you will. The danger signs are all around us, and if we don't continue to fight back in Tasmania, we'll lose our right to consider ourselves part of the Aboriginal community of Australia. Keeping up to date with developments, lobbying politicians and joining public protests are obvious and easy ways of helping. The monitoring of the Northern Territory invasion by alliances such as the Women's for WIC is documented on their website, and they're seeking expressions of support to send to the politicians. The current crisis where Aborigines are yet again at the centre of a political storm, not from our making, must end, and I hope that you'll all be part of the solution. And just before I finish, I'd just like to recite a poem that I kind of think sums up what I've been talking about today. I remember the day the pale ones came, the thunder roared and the oceans raged. I remember the first one who stepped on our land, tall and white with a thunderstick in his hand. The sky grew dark and the wind it blew, yet still the new invader's thunderstick grew. The children screamed and the women did cry, and all the men could do was die. It didn't take long for this slaughter to end, black man murdered by his new white friend. This land was once green but is now red, as we cried, mourned and buried our dead. Racism is dead, it just doesn't exist, is what the politicians try to insist. We've come a long way on the right trail, yet still hundreds of blacks have died in your jail. Alcohol and disease have taken their toll, destroyed our brains and captured our soul. The heart is still there, though somewhat dead, still aching and sore from where it was bled. But one day soon my people will rise and clear the black clouds from our eyes. The whites will go and we will be free to sing, dance and corroborate. So rise up, young brothers, all is not sold. Believe in yourself, the red, black and gold. This land is ours, every hill, every tree. So reach for your heart and set your soul free. Thank you.